I once thought we were teammates, brothers in the same battle. But I learned the hard way. Some people don't climb with you. They climb over you. Leonard Nimoy, the man who transformed Spock into a cultural force that shattered borders, languages, and generations. The cool-faced, half-human, half-Vulcan outsider. The quiet conscience of Star Trek. One of the most enduring science fiction icons of the 20th century. Actor, director, photographer, poet. A multi-talented artist admired by millions. But behind the applause, there were scars. Because Nimoy's life wasn't just success and standing ovations. It was also broken trust, quiet betrayals, moments where he was underestimated, used, or pushed aside, and people he genuinely could not forgive. Nimoy despised one particular kind of person. Those who see themselves as the center of the universe. Those who demand the spotlight no matter who they eclipse. The hypocrites who preach unity on camera and sharpen the knife backstage. Above all, he couldn't tolerate those who treated friendship like a tool, showing up when they needed something and vanishing the moment the job was done. And heartbreakingly, one of those people was once his closest ally. A colleague, a confidant, someone who felt like an artistic soulmate. And in the end, the person who hurt him the most. Who were they? Stay locked in, because the final name in this story will force you to see Leonard Nimoy and Star Trek in a completely different light. William Shatner. From brothers in life and death to strangers. Let's begin with a name that still makes the Star Trek universe tense whenever it's mentioned. William Allen Shatner. The original Star Trek set in the 1960s was anything but glamorous. Long days, tight budgets, constant pressure from the network. Everyone knew the show could be canceled at any moment. In that chaos, Nimoy and Shatner found balance in each other. Two men carrying a show no one believed in yet, sharing exhaustion between takes, quiet encouragement in dim hallways. Shatner once stood in the front row at Nimoy's wedding, smiling like he was watching his own future unfold. But success has a shadow. Star Trek didn't just survive, it exploded. And it wasn't Captain Kirk who captured the audience's soul. It was Spock. Half human, half Vulcan, cold, logical, vulnerable in ways no one expected. Fan letters poured in by the thousands, media attention shifted. Crew members noticed it, fans felt it. And according to multiple co-stars, Shatner felt it most of all. On set, things changed. Shatner began watching the camera constantly, every angle, every line, every second of screen time. Arguments broke out over who stood center frame, who entered the shot first, who delivered the final line. Because to Shatner, the center wasn't just blocking, it was power. Nimoy later said in interviews that Shatner had a way of pulling all the light toward himself, an ego that was magnetic but dangerous. The same force that created a star could quietly crush everyone nearby. For a long time, Nimoy stayed silent, until one day, silence wasn't enough. Crew members still talk about the moment it finally cracked. In a cramped break room, far from the cameras, the tension exploded. Shatner slammed his cup onto the table, water splashing over the edge. Nimoy leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes dark and steady. "Are you trying to block me from my own show?" Shatner snapped, voice controlled but razor sharp. "Everyone talks about Spock now, the press, the fan mail, the crew. You think that's fair?" Nimoy can raise his voice. He never needed to. "I'm not blocking anyone, Bill," he said quietly. "I'm doing my job. The audience loves the character, and that isn't my fault." Shatner stepped closer, shoulders tight. "Not your fault. You take extra lines, extend scenes, you turn Spock into the center." Nimoy shook his head, slowly. Each word that followed felt heavy enough to bend the room. And from that moment on, the friendship was never the same. And this was only the beginning. Bill, the problem isn't Spock. The problem is that you can't stand not being the only one people love. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and inescapable, turning the small break room into something claustrophobic. For a few seconds, William Shatner said nothing. Silence stretched. Then he answered, not with explanation, not with apology, but with a sentence delivered like a blade. "I am Captain Kirk." A door slammed. One of them walked away, and in that instant, something fragile fractured. From that day forward, the smiles never fully reached their eyes. In front of the cameras, they still laughed. On screen, they still portrayed unbreakable loyalty, fighting side by side in life and death moments that defined a generation. But behind the scenes, an invisible distance had taken hold, quiet, permanent, and impossible to ignore. After Star Trek, the world saw what looked like continuity. They still collaborated, they still posed for photographs, they still appeared together as twin legends, forever bound by the same universe. There were dinners with both families, long phone calls, convention tours and promotional trips that suggested time had healed old wounds. To the public, it seemed as though whatever tension once existed had faded into history. But the truth was far less comforting. The crack never closed. It was simply buried, covered over by layers of fame, professionalism, and obligation. The damage remained, hidden beneath the surface. Then came the final rupture. The Captains, a documentary directed by Shatner himself. The project was meant to celebrate the men who had played Starfleet captains, a reflective tribute to legacy and leadership. But according to those involved, footage featuring Leonard Nimoy was used without clear permission. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a technical oversight, a legal gray area, nothing more than industry bureaucracy. To Nimoy, it was something else entirely. This was a man who lived his entire life straddling the line between character and self, who had spent decades negotiating where Spock ended and Leonard Nimoy began. What might have been a professional inconvenience to someone else felt to him like a violation, a boundary crossed, a trust broken. This time, Nimoy didn't argue. He went silent. Calls went unanswered, messages received no reply, appearances together stopped. The distance that had once been invisible became unmistakable. Years later, Shatner would admit that the silence devastated him. He said he thought Nimoy was joking. He never imagined the situation ran that deep. He never believed it would become final. But time does not wait for misunderstandings to resolve themselves. In February 2015, the news broke. Leonard Nimoy had passed away. Somewhere else, a man who had once stood beside him as best man at his wedding sat unable to say goodbye, uninvited, unwelcome, and left outside the final chapter. No last conversation, no closure, no final word. In his later years, Nimoy once reflected that some people cannot be forgiven, not because their actions were unforgivable, but because they reached too deep. They touched the part of you that once believed completely, once trusted fully, once thought of them as family, as a brother. William Shatner was one of those people. And perhaps that is why this story lingers, why it does more than spark curiosity. It leaves a tightness in the chest, the kind that comes from looking back at a great friendship that might have survived if only it had been given one last chance. When we examine their journey, the most painful truth isn't how many times they clashed or how deeply they hurt one another. It's that the ending never arrived. The final moment, the one where everything could have been said, never came. Yet even this is still only a story about two men made of flesh and memory. Because beyond friendship, beyond ego, beyond betrayal, there exists another conflict, one that reaches past the actors themselves and into the soul of the universe they inhabited. A struggle not just over credit or control, but over identity, over legacy. The Gene Roddenberry controversy. The battle over the soul of an icon. Gene Roddenberry, the great bird of the galaxy, the man who breathed life into the Enterprise, the architect who imagined a future bold enough to believe humanity could be better, the creator who gave birth to Star Trek itself. And the moment his vision was challenged, the conflict grew larger than any single friendship could contain. To Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry was never just the man who created Star Trek. This was not a war of shouting matches or public clashes, but a battle of minds, where authority and creativity wrapped around each other like tightening threads. Some conflicts never reach the camera. They burn quietly, like embers beneath ash. The relationship between Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett carried exactly that heat. On the surface, everything appeared civil. Beneath it, the tension never slept. Bennett arrived at Star Trek as the franchise entered a new cinematic phase. After the divisive first film, the studio demanded change, new energy, sharper focus. Bennett, a seasoned, pragmatic, decisive producer, was handed the controls. He didn't just produce, he rebuilt the structure. He reshaped the storytelling approach and pushed Star Trek II into a new trajectory, restoring momentum and credibility. At the same time, Nimoy was crossing his own threshold, evolving from actor to director, from embodying Spock to shaping the entire world around him. Power shifted, roles overlapped, boundaries blurred, and in that shared space, friction emerged. Both men were intelligent, both deeply experienced, and both cared too much about Star Trek to simply step aside. When Star Trek IV entered production, their collaboration reached its most delicate stage. This was the film Nimoy wanted to make, in his own distinct voice, lighter in tone, ecological in theme, placing the crew in the modern world. To Nimoy, Star Trek was never just starships and galaxies, it was a mirror held up to humanity. But to Bennett, every creative shift carried financial risk. He had plans, carefully balanced story beats, budget calculations, studio expectations. And when Nimoy arrived with bold new ideas, those equations were thrown off balance. "Harve," Nimoy said one night, turning back after hours of thought, his voice worn but steady. "We can't just make another movie and move on. The fourth one has to matter. It can't be just battles and new enemies. It has to say something about people." Bennett exhaled slowly, but his gaze remained firm. "Leonard, I'm not against meaning, but I have to make sure audiences show up. The studio needs returns, you know that." Nimoy stepped forward, placing his hand on the script, tapping lines he had circled. "And I know these characters. This line has to change. Spock wouldn't say this. He's been reborn. He's different now. We can't turn him into comic relief." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "You're directing this film, I respect that, but I'm the producer. I carry the final responsibility. Major changes come through me." The air sharpened, invisible but cutting. Nimoy tightened his grip on the script, his voice harder than usual, rare for him. "Then you're limiting me, Harve. You're telling me I can only direct inside a frame you've already built." Bennett stood abruptly, hands pressing into the table. "Because someone has to keep this ship from crashing into the rocks. Leonard, I know you're an artist, I respect that, but Star Trek is a franchise now. Hundreds of jobs, millions of dollars. No one gets absolute freedom." Nimoy fell silent, his eyes half closed, as if holding something back. Then he spoke slowly, deliberately. "I'm not asking for privilege. I'm asking for enough creative freedom not to betray what we're holding in our hands." They stared at one another. No more words were spoken, but a fracture had formed when both men felt from that moment on. Every meeting afterward carried a chill, every email, every scene approval. Yet the irony remains, that very tension produced success. Star Trek IV became one of the most beloved films in the franchise. Time moved on. More films followed. The Enterprise kept flying. The public saw only smiles on stage, polite interviews, gracious thank yous. Behind the scenes, Nimoy learned that directing meant navigating a web of competing decisions, not absolute control. Bennett learned that some artists possess a creative force too strong to fully contain. And as this chapter closes, there is no image of hatred, only two men standing at opposite ends of the ship, each determined to guide it safely forward, endlessly arguing over how to hold the helm. This was a real battle, quiet, professional, and devastating without a single raised fist. It needed no exaggeration to tighten the listener's chest, because between power and art, Between the machinery behind the scenes and the glow of the spotlight, there is always a fragile line, and anyone who crosses it pays a price. V. Nicholas Meyer, The Fracture of Trust. Nicholas Meyer entered the Star Trek universe like a cold, clarifying wind, sharp and unmistakably different. With Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, he rescued a struggling franchise and pulled it back into brilliant orbit. And Leonard Nimoy, weathered by storms with producers, writers, and studios, saw in Meyer something rare, a possible ally. At first, their collaboration felt almost perfect. Meyer brought structure, urgency, a relentless enemy, and sharp pacing. Nimoy brought philosophy, emotional weight, and moral gravity. Two creative lines converging at what felt like the ideal point. Nimoy even put his own reputation on the line to support Meyer's continued involvement in later projects. That was when the fractures began to show. Because Nicholas Meyer was not simply executing someone else's vision, he was a director. And directors at their core want to leave a signature. The real tension ignited when early scripts for Star Trek VI landed on the table. Nimoy envisioned a story steeped in reconciliation, about evolution, about moving from cold logic toward deeper empathy with humanity. Meyer saw something else, a darker, rougher world shaded with cynicism. He wanted characters pushed into moral gray zones, into choices that were not clean or heroic. To Meyer, that was authenticity. To Nimoy, it was a dangerous edge, where exploration became distortion and depth threatened to erode the soul of what had been built. Long meetings behind closed doors slowly transformed into ideological combat. "You're turning Spock into someone I no longer recognize," Nimoy said, his voice restrained but firm. Meyer folded his arms, calm but distant. "I'm making him three-dimensional, not a statue meant to be worshipped." Nimoy gripped his glasses, then set them aside. "Three-dimensional doesn't mean undoing decades of meaning. Spock represents harmony. You're pushing him into shadow for the sake of drama." Meyer stood abruptly, his voice sharper now. "And you want perfection frozen in time. The audience has changed. The world has changed. If Star Trek only survives on nostalgia, it dies." Nimoy stepped closer. "But that is Spock, and that responsibility is mine." "No," Meyer answered, pointing at the script between them. "This is my film." Silence crashed down like steel. Papers rustled. Eyes avoided contact. No one in the room dared breathe too loudly. Then Nimoy stepped back. No anger left, only clarity. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we are no longer speaking the same language." They never became public enemies, but something essential broke. Nimoy felt betrayed, not by disagreement, but by misplaced trust. He had elevated Meyer into the circle of those he believed understood Spock. That belief collapsed into a hollow distance. When Star Trek VI was released, it was met with praise. Critics and audiences celebrated its maturity, its sharpness, its sense of farewell. To most viewers, Spock was still there, logical, composed, only subtly altered. The franchise was applauded for growing up. And that success made Nimoy's feelings even more complex. He could not deny Meyer's skill, he could not deny the film's power, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice lingered. "My Spock took a step I'm not sure I chose." That is the quiet tragedy of art. Even victory can leave invisible scars. Sixth, Leonard Nimoy, Legacy Behind the Lens. When Leonard Nimoy passed away in 2015, the world lost more than an actor. It lost an icon, a philosopher without sermons, a storyteller who spoke through silence, posture, and presence, through moments no dialogue could ever replace. Leonard Nimoy's legacy was never confined to pointed ears and quiet logic. It was something far more delicate, a fusion of art, identity, and cultural impact that later generations still look back on in awe. How could one individual become both a global entertainment icon and a source of such deep, lasting inspiration? Spock may be the first image etched into memory, but it was Leonard Nimoy, the man behind the character, who transformed that image into legend. He didn't simply recite lines or obey direction. He studied, he questioned, he constructed a character with a level of psychological depth rarely seen on 1960s American television. Nimoy understood that Spock was never just an alien defined by logic. He was the embodiment of humanity's oldest struggle, the tension between reason and emotion, duty and identity. Because of Nimoy, every raised eyebrow, every carefully measured pause, every subtle tilt of Spock's head became communication. They spoke of empathy, restraint, and the quiet power of intellect in a chaotic world. And Nimoy's artistic footprint reached far beyond Star Trek. His career stretched across independent cinema, network television, directing, and producing. Projects like 3 Men and a Baby and In Search Of revealed a storyteller capable of moving effortlessly between humor and gravity, simplicity and mystery, science, culture, and myth. Not all of his work became iconic, but its diversity revealed something more important: a spirit unwilling to be trapped by fame or a single role. He inspired not just through technique, but through attitude. Respect for character, gratitude toward collaborators, and an unwavering commitment to personal values in an industry filled with compromises. Beyond acting, Nimoy expressed himself as a director, photographer, poet, and writer. His range stood as proof that creativity refuses to be boxed into a single title. One person, he showed us, can be a television legend, an unspoken philosopher, a visual artist, and still remain deeply authentic. This is what makes Nimoy timeless. Not just an icon for Star Trek fans, but a symbol for anyone who believes art should carry meaning. He represented the complete artist, a creator who engages with the world, an icon who remains grounded, a legend who understands his own limits. Less widely discussed, but equally vital, was Nimoy's capacity for reconciliation. Even amid conflicts that stretched across decades, he consistently demonstrated calm reflection and the ability to see opposing perspectives. He understood that conflict is inseparable from creative life, and that how one confronts or accepts is what leads to maturity. This lesson, quiet but profound, may surpass any award or role he ever received. Nimoy also left behind unspoken guidance on navigating disappointment, betrayal, and fractured trust. His strained relationships with Shatner, Roddenberry, Berman, Bennett, and Meyer reveal that even a brilliant mind struggles to protect what it values. Each clash, each fracture became a lesson for those striving to succeed without sacrificing integrity. That is his deeper educational legacy. Not everyone will understand you, not every bond will survive, but extraordinary work can still emerge from perseverance and honesty with oneself. Today, Leonard Nimoy is no longer just the calm smile beneath Spock's pointed ears. He stands as a fully human figure, driven by pride in his craft, guided by self-respect, capable of loving a character so deeply it caused him pain. Beneath the myth, beneath the fame, he was always an artist. And artists, inevitably, pay a price for what they believe. Looking back, we're left with a question. Was Leonard Nimoy a man defined by conflict, or did Star Trek, with its towering ambition and overwhelming legacy, turn everyone involved into both allies and adversaries? His story is more than behind-the-scenes history. It's a mirror. Relationships that appear beautiful yet crack under pressure. Trust placed too quickly. Friendships that heal and wound at the same time. Nimoy was not flawless. He loved fiercely, felt anger and disappointment, made choices, and was sometimes hurt by the very creation he helped shape. Star Trek carried us among the stars, but Leonard Nimoy's real journey unfolded inward, between self-respect and loyalty, friendship and betrayal. When the lights dim and the prosthetic ears are set aside, what remains is an artist sitting with questions a lifetime can't fully answer. And perhaps that is why this story lingers. not because of scandal, but because it reveals a simple truth. Behind every legend beats a deeply human heart. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you see Leonard Nimoy as a victim of the system, or as someone who also helped shape the conflicts that surrounded him?